Today we're going to be painting these lovely pale roses in loose watercolour and explore some fantastic negative painting techniques to bring these roses to life. Then we'll add some ink line details to make those roses really stand out. Hi, I'm Ohn Mar. I'm an artist, illustrator and author, and I help artists improve their skills by sharing my knowledge from filling 45 sketchbooks. Last month I was very fortunate enough to co-host a watercolour workshop at Lower Norton Flower Farm in Hampshire in the UK. It was an absolutely beautiful weekend. We had a tremendous amount of fun looking at the flowers and painting what was in bloom. This is one of the demos that I created whilst on the flower farm. It's of these beautiful, very pale peachy roses. If I show you really close up, you can see that only the middle part of these roses have been painted in any type of watercolour, it's just a very light wash. And I was actually able to give the roses form by painting very dark green, blue shape around it. So we are defining the shapes around the roses, and that's the negative space around it, and I'm using that a lot in my recent watercolour work. What you're going to need is some watercolours. This is the Winsor & Newton pan set. Also, I like to use a quill brush, mainly because I'm able to pick up so much pigment. This actual brush can spread a whole load of colour very, very quickly. It's by Jackson's Art, and it's their S777 series, and I'm using a size 0. The watercolour paper that we used on the workshop was this Hahnemühle Anniversary Edition watercolour paper, and it is 425 GSM, which is quite thick, and it comes as a gummed block. If I show you the side of this, it's actually glued down. The reason for that is because you are putting down a lot of water, the gummed edges helps to keep the paper stretched. Also, I really love the grain on this. It's not too textured, it's quite smooth, so that when I come to do the inking, it's just perfect for my needs. So I'm going to start off by mixing that lovely central part of each of these roses, using some of this Winsor red with some cadmium orange, and it has to be quite watered down. And in the middle of each one I'm going to drop in a much more concentrated orange and just let that spread out. Oh, that's perfect. Draw some of the pigment out by just using clean water that I've just added to my brush, and we're going to leave it like that. Hopefully it's going to diffuse out. Now we are going to start defining the edge of these roses. I'm going to mix up a pale green. I've got a green gold here. Otherwise you can use a little bit of sap green with some yellow, like a lemon yellow. I'm going to do that by really simplifying down the shape of this rose. I know it has an awful lot of petals. Again, we still want the wash to be quite light. I'm almost using geometric shapes, so it is the outline that it is creating. I'm trying to get the shape down. It goes off at an angle. I'm not concentrating, getting too caught up in any kind of detail right now. It does dip in a little bit for the next rose along on the left. So let's start defining that. And I'm using quite deliberate, mindful movements. I know it looks like a bit of a mess at the moment, but we can define certain areas using ink as well. And I'm going to fill in quite quickly the rest of the area here using that light green wash that we've already made, because we need to let this layer dry here. Most of the leaves are happening up here in the reference. So let's mix up a dark green. So I'm using like a Prussian green there, my beloved Payne's grey. Top tip for this is mix lots of pigment into it. You want it to be pretty dark. So I'm adding quite a lot of the Payne's grey, sap green as well. One leaf I can see
is popping out of this area here. There is a lot of pigment. I've not scrimped on the pigment. That's something that I think a lot of people have trouble with, but we just have to be bold. I will talk a little bit more now about the negative space. You can tell an area of watercolour isn't dry because there is a sheen, and if I was to drop in some watercolour on top of that now, it would spread, and that's not the effect I'm trying to achieve. Now we are going to fill some of the area here with negative space painting. I can see 3 leaves about here.
Negative painting might seem complicated at first, but it's not hard once you get the basics. When you paint a picture, you have 2 types of spaces to think about, positive and negative. Positive space is your main subject, the thing that you want people to notice. And negative space is the area around and between your subject. It's not the main focus, but it can make your subject stand out. By playing with these 2 spaces, you can make your paintings more interesting. For example, when you see the dark areas around the leaves in this painting, these dark spaces help define the shape of the leaves and also make them look like they're coming forward. So it's creating depth and making things look a little bit more 3-dimensional. You can also make certain parts stand out because your eyes are naturally drawn to the areas with the most contrast. Often in my paintings I use a mixture of positive and negative space. I think it's a really lovely balance. To make images like this more visually striking, you need to use strong contrast between the light and the dark areas. Having really dark areas next to a light area creates the best impact. If the negative and positive parts of your painting are too similar in values, that is their lightness and the darkness, they just won't pop. So aim for a clear difference to make your painting really stand out. We need to let this layer dry completely before adding some of our ink details, which I'm going to show you next.
This is my favourite nib. It is called the Blue Pumpkin by Browser, and the ink I'm going to be using is this Winsor & Newton Nut Brown. I'm going to start by adding details. I use ink to add a final layer of details. And the middle of this rose are the little stamens which kind of go round. You can buy other nibs. This is my favourite one because it's kind of all-purpose. And I like the fact that when I press down hard, I can get lines like that, just very gentle. I can create much thinner strokes, and it's a personal preference. So I'm going to add a few petal details. That's perfect. I'm going to be really light with my touch. There's one petal here. I'm not going to add all the petals. I'm not outlining, I'm just looking at where can I see the most contrast, and if I squint my eyes, there's less light going into my eyes so that it can differentiate sort of different areas of light and shadow much better.
It's really tempting to try and outline every single petal to add all that extra detail, but actually the brain is wonderful in making assumptions of what probably goes there. So leave it up to your viewer's imagination. When beginners start, it can be quite awkward, but as we learn to vary the pressure we apply on the stroke, we can help those lines be more dynamic and bring them to life. At workshops and at in-person events, I often say to the attendees, this is like a crazy trust exercise. Please trust that you have provided enough information for the viewer to decide what's happening in this leaf, what's happening with this flower. On some of the leaves I've added indication of veins, in some of them I haven't, and in some of the leaves I've gone over into the negative space area, and that's absolutely fine. I'm trying to give a bit more information by using ink to outline a particular leaf because there's just a little bit too much space there, and also I've decided that there's probably a little bit too much white space or negative space in the lower section, so I'm going to try and fill some of that up by adding a rosebud that I can see peeking through between the two roses, although I've just put it on the right to try and fill that space. I often swap and change the composition as I go along. I don't have like a fixed agenda. I had an accident with a blob of ink, and I actually decided to incorporate it by extending some of the leaves down and adding a stem so that our eye is also drawn downwards, which makes for a much more balanced composition overall. I decided to add a little bit more dark areas between the roses just to really define their shapes, and I think that's really made a difference. I think this piece has worked out beautifully. There's a real soft lightness to the roses, and when you combine that with the much more structured, darker background, it creates such an impact, and visually it's very interesting for me to look at and also to work on. So I hope you enjoy creating your own version of these roses.